I'm not as deadly at rap as that last crew. But first of all, I'd like to say Ginage, Dorawa, Nanalingu, Ngagagu. From the Gumbaynggirr people of the north coast of New South Wales, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land we're on today. I'd like to pay my respects to all the elders of all the mobs that are here today, and I'd like to pay my respects to everyone who's crazy enough to sit in this sun today. Welcome to the long hot summer in March. I'm not sure why I'm here today. My thing is pretty much the same as Jimmer and the Young Warriors, and I'd like people to consider the proposition. Why is it that Triple J won't play the Young Warriors? Get on your computers tonight, folks. Send an email. Demand to know. You're the people. Perhaps it's because Jimmer and the Young Warriors in essence are on about the same sort of thing as me, the same sort of thing as many people before me. Indigenous people who've played very important roles in the history of the landscape that we're in right now. In the crowd today, I've seen all manner of legendary people who've very much been part of the history of the Melbourne Aboriginal community and the time I've spent here in the last almost 40 years. And I think it's important that people know a little bit about history. You know, my thing is about history partly because I spent the first half of my life making history, and I intend to spend the last half of my life teaching and writing history. History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it, folks, you know. And the hallowed sort of upper echelons of the history departments in the universities of Australia needs people like me. I mean, in the last 10 years or so, a very important sort of thing has happened in Australian society, an event called the History Wars. If any of you mob have been wondering why Johnny Howard was so nasty to us and why there was a protracted campaign of vilification and denigration of Aboriginal people for the last decade or more, a lot of it's got to do with the History Wars. The History Wars began around the time that the Hawke government was in power. The History Wars were about an argument about Australian history. Until the 1970s, Aboriginal people's stories had been effectively written out of Australian history. When I went to school in the 50s in Australia, there was no reference to Aboriginal people apart from saying they threw boomerangs and they all died out after Captain Cook got here. Essentially trivial, meaningless, false information like that. So effectively there was this silence in Australian history from the time Australia began in 1901 through to the 1970s. Then momentarily a new generation of Australian historians started to tell the Aboriginal story, tell the Aboriginal experience of Australian history. What happened to the Aboriginal people really in this country? And for a brief period, about 5 to 10 years, Australia began to change in its attitudes to Indigenous people as they became more aware of their own history. They didn't feel threatened by it. They didn't feel that they were somehow lesser persons because of it. In most instances, intelligent Australian people realised that by knowing, by having a knowledge and an understanding and awareness and having analysed the mistakes of the past in Australian history, there is a lot to be learned about the path we go in the future. And so it was a non-threatening thing. But then along come some fairly high-power right-wing lunatics, folks, out there in, you know, lunatic land, fringe land, on the lunatic fringe of Australian history. People like Professor Keith Windshuttle, is he a professor? Have I promoted him? Who decided, possibly because he sold a lot of books when he did it, to challenge these histories, but not just challenge in a rational, logical, intelligent way, challenge in a way that sought to denigrate Aboriginal people, denigrate and deny the Aboriginal existence. Denialism is what the history wars were all about. After the Second World War, Australia was amongst all of those victor nations that pointed their fingers at the Japanese and the Germans and said, you must teach your children the truth about your history. To this day, when occasionally the Japanese are seen to be fiddling with parts of their history and sanitising it a bit, there's a big chorus of Australians demanding that their children be taught the truth of their history. To deny the truth of Aboriginal history that is there by the truckload in the archives around Australia. If Keith Windshuttle or any other historian wants the evidence, it's there, folks. There's no shortage of evidence. But still, there are those, even though their great patron John Howard is now gone, to right-wing think tanks in America, speak of hundreds of thousands of bucks, where nobody cares this end. Even though he's gone, there are those who persist. The Andrew Bolts of our world, you know, the great Melbourne intellectual who writes for that great intellectual journal, the Herald Scum in Melbourne. These are the people who continue with their denialism. I say history is important. If I can teach history to young non-Indigenous kids at Melbourne University without them feeling threatened or feeling less as human beings because they learn this, then so too can we all. The only good thing in my mind about little Kevin Rudd's apology a week or so ago was that there were so many young Australian kids. I saw them in Fed Square, all over Australia, in the schools throughout Australia. That generation sat and listened and heard. I truly hope that that generation can be the first generation of Australians to grow up in this country free of the irrational, illogical guilt that has burdened and destroyed so much of the effective debate in the past. In that sense, I think we can look forward to at least a better decade than that which has just gone before. I hope for the sake of my kids, for your kids, that this is a new era. But folks, I've always had this terrible affliction. I've got this big problem, and my problem is that I hate politicians. It doesn't matter who you vote for, a politician gets in. You know? If voting could change anything, it'd be illegal, and all the graffiti you ever read, folks. I've got no faith in politicians, be they Labor Party or Liberal Party. When the Deputy Prime Minister of this country and the local member for around here was Mr Brian Howe, member of the Australian Labor Party, Minister in the Hawke and Keating government, when we were in the midst, and not just me and Aboriginal people, there was a community out in Northlands we should never forget. The kids of Northland Secondary College, the only people in this community in the early days of Jeff Kennett's reign who were game to take him on, challenge him and fight him right down to the last. Right down to the last, folks. 3 years it took, but we beat him. We won, and Northland Secondary College is out there today because of a small group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous parents, a small group of committed teachers, and a big bunch of very brave kids, some of whom are here today and who are genuine legends and heroes of local history. But never forget, when we're in the midst of our fight with Kennett, the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, a Labor Party man, who I would have thought had no, reason to back Kennett up, we went and demanded that the federal government intervene. And his advice to me was, he said, Gary, yous can't win. Why don't you just give up now? That was the words of our local member, Brian Howe. Unfortunately, he's no longer here, so you can't vote against him now. But know the truth of his history. Know the truth of the ALP history and how they've sold us and you out all the way down the track. Beware, be warned. Don't trust this new guy too much. He'll end up like all the rest. That's all the word I can tell you. Thank you.